Security pulled black woman off plane. Then she pulled $4 billion in funding from the airline. They didn't need to ask her name. Just one glance at her skin color and the worn-down soles of her shoes was enough to decide she didn't belong here. 5:43 a.m. Eastbrook International Airport was still submerged in quiet fluorescent light. The damp morning air carried faint traces of early brewed coffee and jet fuel. Amid the blurry stream of passengers rushing past fogged-up glass panels, a woman stepped into the first-class boarding zone. Not hurriedly, not ostentatiously, but with just enough presence to make the space pause for a beat. Adelaise Baker, 38 years old, female, black, 5 feet 6 inches tall, dressed in a plain navy hoodie, simple jeans, and a pair of worn Converse sneakers. Over her shoulder hung only a faded beige tote. No Louis Vuitton luggage, no gold status lanyard, and not even a single glance signaling she wanted to be noticed. She bore none of the signs of privilege. And because of that, every gaze around her immediately defaulted. She didn't belong. At the front of the priority lane stood a check-in agent named Carolyn, blonde hair tied high, matte red lipstick, who glanced up from her tablet and frowned almost instinctively. Her eyes scanned Adelaise the way one might inspect a lost passenger who had wandered in from a budget airline. "Excuse me?" Carolyn tilted her head, her voice polite to the point of frost. "This area is reserved for executive and first-class travelers. There was no request for a boarding pass, no verification process, just an automatic rejection, because from the very first look, Carolyn had already decided. The woman before her couldn't possibly belong in seat 2A. Adelaise said nothing. She simply pulled her phone from her hoodie pocket and held up the digital boarding pass. The QR code glowed clearly on the screen. No trembling, no defiance, no explanation. "Seat 2A, she said, her voice low, brief, without fatigue. Carolyn hesitated slightly. Though trained to handle unexpected scenarios, her expression still betrayed a fleeting moment of confusion. Her fingers swiped across the scanner, and the beep of confirmation rang out loud and clear. But instead of offering the usual apology or welcome, Carolyn turned to her colleague on the right, leaned in, and whispered just loud enough for Adelaise to hear. Thought she was lost. Her colleague let out a soft chuckle, the kind shared between two people who had just witnessed an amusing glitch in the system. Right behind Adelaise, a white man in a gray suit with Bluetooth earpieces stepped forward. Carolyn didn't ask anything, didn't scan any code. She simply smiled and nodded. "Good morning, sir. You may proceed." The process here wasn't a process. It was a habit of deciding who deserved to be served. Adelaise kept walking, eyes unblinking. She didn't turn around, didn't react. She was used to the kind of silence wrapped in the label of procedure. She didn't need to raise her voice, knowing full well that every expression had already been captured by the cameras, and what mattered most was who had access to those camera feeds. None of them knew that the woman they had just dismissed wasn't here to relax. She wasn't here to be served. She was here to observe. Because when you're the one who signs off on a $4.1 billion deal, you don't need to show up flashy. You just let the system reveal itself. And when it does, you don't have to speak. You just take note. She continued onto the plane, her gaze calm, her steps unrushed. Because every move from this point on, every word spoken, every raised eyebrow, every glance thrown her way, was already part of the test. If you've enjoyed the story so far, take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more powerful and gripping stories from Black Strength Stories. Right after stepping through the boarding gate, Adelaise was directed toward the baggage security checkpoint, a section that, based on her current ticket class and itinerary, she should have bypassed via TSA pre-check. Her boarding information, encrypted by Genesis Holdings, for rapid identification, displayed. Priority flag, cleared. No additional screening. But that wasn't enough. A security officer, about 40 years old with a broad build, motioned with his hand. "You, step to the left." Random check. The words were gentle, but in no way a request. It was a command, wrapped in the polite language of service. Adelaise wasn't surprised. She didn't protest. She was familiar with the new definition of random, a definition she'd heard from far too many passengers of color who had been coincidentally checked among hundreds of white travelers. She placed her tote bag on the inspection table. Inside were items so simple they left no room for suspicion. A paperback book, The Silent Consent, 2021 edition. A small leather notebook, a zip pouch of travel-sized cosmetics, and a sealed envelope stamped with red wax, embossed with a crescent-shaped insignia, the security emblem of Genesis Financial Holdings. The inspector, a woman with a tired look about her, opened the bag and glanced over each item. When she reached the envelope, her hand paused. "What's this?" Adelaise met her eyes directly, voice steady and clear. "Legal documents. Private." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Are you a lawyer?" The question slipped out like a reflex, an assumption that if these were legal papers, then the black woman in front of her must be something questionable. "Not exactly." The reply was brief, needing no elaboration. The inspector's eyes lingered on the envelope, as if weighing whether she should open it. But then, either by instinct or some unspoken directive, she released it. "All right, go ahead." Throughout it all, Adelaise kept her expression unchanged, still cautious, revealing no reaction. But she had seen. She had noted. And she knew precisely the pattern she was moving through. Right behind her, a white man in a 4-button suit, pulling a Rimowa suitcase and accompanied by a wife wearing a Cartier necklace, stepped up. The officer merely nodded. "Morning, sir." No one asked to open his bag. No one asked for paperwork. An elderly woman wearing Versace glasses, clutching a wrinkled paper first-class ticket, trembled slightly, unsure where to go. A staff member rushed over. "Let me help you, ma'am." In under 3 minutes, Adelaise had witnessed the machinery of unequal treatment operate like a set of reflexes. And she knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was systemic instinct, designed to disguise itself as protocol. What none of them knew was that the internal surveillance system, the tool they trusted to ensure security, was also capturing all these behaviors and transmitting them directly to a private server at the Genesis headquarters in Chicago. She continued past the security gate, where the green light blinked and the scanner swept across her body. She didn't need to look back, but she knew exactly who was standing where, who was smirking behind her, who was putting on the face of just following procedures. Adelaise carried no weapons, but she knew she was wielding a kind of power these people couldn't see. And that was what made them misjudge him, everyone. It had been 3 years since Genesis Holdings had sent her an encrypted letter containing only one sentence. "Before we invest, let us know if they deserve to be trusted." Since then, she had become a verifier, the one who posed as an unnoticed guest, experiencing services meant for the elite to see whether the system still upheld fairness when faced with someone they didn't think was worth anything. And today, with an unopened red envelope and a phone in her pocket quietly linked to a hidden monitoring system, Adelaise Baker had begun an evaluation that Havenport Airlines had no idea was underway. That test had officially begun the moment Carolyn refused to look at the boarding pass, and now it was being analyzed by the system, second by second. Gate C12 rang out with a familiar sound. Now boarding Group 1, First Class and Executive Platinum. The female announcer's voice, clear and emotionless like an automated system, served as background noise for the usual scene unfolding across the carpeted walkway. Adelaise Baker stood up. Not in a rush. Not showy. She stepped out from the back corner seating area, where sunlight streamed diagonally through the window pane, glinting off the red envelope that had rested on her lap for nearly half an hour. She wasn't scrolling on her phone. She wasn't listening to music. She didn't reach for wireless earbuds like the other first-class passengers around her. Instead, she sat there, a still silhouette in a bustling space. And it was precisely that silence that made her stand out more than any Burberry coat or Hermes bag in the terminal. When it was her turn, she held up her phone. The QR code lit up brightly, but the gate attendant, a curly-haired Irish woman wearing a name tag that read, Marisa, looked at her for 2 seconds longer than usual. "Boarding Group 1 is for first class and executive platinum only," she said softly, though her tone hinted clearly at suspicion. Adelaise didn't sigh. She simply held the screen closer. "Seat 2A, confirmed on ticket." Marisa tapped the scanner, and a beep rang out. No errors. But in her eyes remained an unconscious hesitation. The man ahead, dressed in a light gray suit and wearing a Rolex Submariner, glanced back. In that brief eye contact, he seemed to be asking himself, "She got the wrong gate?" As Adelaise stepped onto the jet bridge, she could feel the atmosphere around her shift. It wasn't just the chill of the air conditioning, but the stares. From behind, from either side, from the cockpit window as the pilot passed by. A black woman with no makeup, no designer brands, walking straight into first class. That alone was enough to make the other first-class passengers feel uneasy. Seat 2A was by the window, near the first overhead bin. The seat reclined to 160 degrees, wrapped in cream-colored leather, with a 21-inch personal screen. On the tray table lay the crew introduction card. Lead flight attendant, Sloane Carter. Adelaise neatly slid her tote under the seat, zipped it up, then sat down. She didn't lean back fully but sat upright, the red envelope still resting on her lap, her hand lightly placed on its edge as if it were sacred. She didn't open it, didn't touch her phone. She waited for the system to begin revealing itself. Flight attendant Sloane approached, hair pinned up, uniform sharply pressed, glossy black low-heeled shoes, her steps practiced and composed. She stopped at row 2, tilted her head slightly. "Good morning." A greeting with no tone, no expression, no eye contact, no name. Adelaise gave a faint nod. Sloane didn't respond, and moved on, turning into row 3. 1 minute later, the attendants began handing out small water bottles to passengers. Row 1, Fiji water. Row 3, Perrier. Row 2. No one stopped by. 13 minutes after everyone had settled, Sloane returned with a younger attendant pushing the beverage cart. The younger woman, probably in her early 20s, leaned down to ask, "What would you like to drink?" Her voice was soft, slightly hesitant. "Just water, please," Adelaise said gently. The girl turned to Sloane, whispered something. Sloane whispered back, then walked forward a few steps and returned with a stiff smile. "Sorry, your ticket class doesn't include complimentary bottled water." Adelaise looked up, her voice not loud, but cutting. "First class doesn't include water." Sloane quickly glanced at the manifest, flipped a page, and replied, "I'll check with the cabin manager." She walked away, saying nothing more. The man in seat 2B, a businessman wearing titanium-rimmed glasses, glanced sideways at Adelaise and muttered, "That's odd. I thought first class always had free drinks." No one said anything else. No one defended her. It wasn't that they didn't notice. They just didn't want to be the one to intervene. Adelaise stared straight out the window. Beneath the thick glass lay runway 4, where the Airbus A330 waited for clearance. Inside the first-class cabin, the temperature was held at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but the air between seats, especially around her, was getting colder by the minute. Not because of the air conditioning, but because her very presence had thrown the entire system off balance. And that was precisely what she came here to verify. As the Airbus A330 pulled away from gate C12 and began taxiing toward runway 3, the first-class cabin settled into a glow of soft amber lighting and the hush of wind brushing past the fuselage. In that space, white cotton towels, freshly steamed, began to be distributed, like a quiet ritual marking the beginning of privilege. But when the tray of towels reached row 2, the service cart hesitated for a beat, then continued rolling forward. Sloane's hand never paused. Her gaze didn't once flicker in Adelaise's direction. The passenger in seat 2B, a businessman from Seattle reviewing a financial report on his iPad, received a towel. Seat 2A? Nothing. This was no longer an oversight. It was intentional, and Adelaise knew it. She remained silent, her hand still gently resting on the red envelope, its wax seal slightly dulled by the cabin temperature. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was something capable of shifting the financial axis of the aviation industry, and Sloane had dismissed it as though it were a standby economy ticket. When the meal service cart began rolling down the aisle, the soft hiss of rubber wheels on flame-resistant wood flooring a steady rhythm, the front rows began receiving menus. Would you like the herb-roasted chicken or the miso-glazed cod? Passengers made their selections, the choices were noted, and dishes were served in sequence. Everything moved smoothly until the cart reached row 2. Sloane didn't ask, didn't stop. She passed by Adelaise as if seat 2A were unoccupied. She served 2B, then moved on. Adelaise waited. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Then she spoke softly, not sharply, not sarcastically, just loud enough to halt the retreating footsteps. "Excuse me. Was I skipped for the meal?" Sloane stopped, turned back as if suddenly recalling her existence. "Oh, I'm not sure you're on the service list." "I'm seated in 2A, Adelaise replied, glancing at the seat number embossed on the armrest. "Sometimes first-class tickets booked with reward points don't include meals," Sloane said quietly, almost whispering, with a smile slick as jet fuel. Adelaise didn't frown, didn't push further. "I'll have the cod," she said, her voice soft but firm like an executive directive. 15 minutes later, the miso cod was placed on her tray table. The fish was cold, the vegetables limp, the rice clumped like jelly. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. She closed the tray lid and gently pushed it forward, untouched by fork or knife. Not because she wasn't hungry, but because the system was testing her, and she intended to register every one of its responses. Not long after, a passenger from row 5 walked up, noise-canceling headphones in hand, and paused beside seat 2A. He rested his hand on the seat back like tapping a rhythm, looked at Sloane, and asked, half loud, half theatrical, "Is she first class?" Sloane pursed her lips, smiled thinly. "She's on the list. Probably used points or something." Loud enough for Adelaise to hear, quiet enough to deny, if needed. She didn't turn her head, didn't speak. But the red envelope on her lap was now clenched tighter, her thumb pressing gently into the edge of the stiff paperboard. Not out of anger, but because she knew she had just entered the second phase of the evaluation, the stage where the system begins to test patience. And as if things weren't already clear enough. 10 minutes later, the cabin manager, man named Bryce, tall, hair slicked back, wearing a dark gray suit with an embossed name tag, approached with a clipboard in hand. "Excuse me, ma'am. It seems there was a small error from the ground check-in system. I need to reconfirm your seat details." No apology. No explanation. Adelaise unlocked her screen and showed the digital boarding pass. Seat 2A, boarding group 1, first class, all displayed. Bryce stared longer than necessary, nodded. "Ah, must have been a data sync issue. I'll make a note." She didn't reply. No need. In her mind, every detail that had just unfolded was now logged into a mental system. Skipped towel, denied beverage, cold meal, gossip from another passenger, unwarranted seat verification. She knew the system hadn't stopped, but it had just exposed its nature. And when a system reveals its structure of bias while believing no one is watching, that's the moment when true power begins to shift. The Airbus 330 touched down on runway 7 at 8:57 a.m., local time, at Chancellor International Airport, Denver. The wheels hissed softly against the concrete. The aircraft shuddered gently, and in the first-class cabin, the seatbelt chimes rang out like a signal for passengers to return to their usual rhythms, checking phones, pulling down bags, folding thin blankets. Adelaise Baker hadn't moved. Her hand still rested lightly on the red envelope bearing Genesis's wax seal, her gaze fixed on the window where sunlight pierced through a layer of thin clouds. No one besides her made conversation, nor did anyone initiate contact. The past 3 hours had been enough for those around her to understand the boundary between her and the not defined by titles, but by the silence she never broke. When the plane came to a full stop at Gate 32, flight attendants began standing up, checking seatbelts, and opening overhead bins. Sloane passed by row 2 without making eye contact with Adelaise. But this time, instead of a hollow smile, she left behind a single remark. "Just a reminder, personal bags should be placed in the overhead during landing." Adelaise looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I've flown before." Without waiting for a reply, she pulled the tote strap, stood up, adjusted her hoodie, and walked out of the cabin slowly, her pace neither hurried nor sluggish, as if time itself moved to her rhythm. But right at the end of the jet bridge, a man in a black suit stood waiting. He wore an airport badge, held a clipboard, and had an earpiece lodged tightly in his right ear. "Ms. Adelaise Baker?" The voice was polite to the point of suspicion. She stopped. "That's me." "We received a request to reconfirm your destination and check-in process. Just an internal procedure," the man said, eyes never leaving the digital nameplate on his tablet. Adelaise didn't respond, only nodded and followed him. They didn't walk through the main terminal, but turned into a side hallway, lined with faded gray carpet, dim fluorescent lights, and vinyl wallpaper peeling slightly at the corners. This wasn't a space for VIPs. It was a space for those being held without calling it detention. The door to Operations Holding 3B opened. Inside was a small, windowless room. No artwork, just a worn veneer desk, and 2 monitors set at uneven angles. A woman was already seated inside, wearing a black blazer, her nameplate reading, Supervisor Turner. "Ms. Baker, we've detected an irregularity in your booking file," Turner began without emotion. "Your ticket appears to have come from an old voucher system no longer valid within our current platform." Adelaise pulled out the chair and sat. She wasn't angry, but she didn't smile. "Are you suggesting I used a fraudulent ticket?" Her voice was low, each word flowing like ice through thickening air. Turner blinked. "We're not making any accusations. We're simply verifying." Adelaise opened her tote. With the precision of someone handling military equipment, she drew out a slim black leather wallet, unzipped a concealed compartment, and pulled out a Level 4 clearance badge. Platinum base, encrypted border, laser-etched with the words, "East and Trust Ident Access." classified holder. She placed the card on the desk, then retrieved the red envelope, turned the Genesis wax seal toward Turner, and set it beside the badge. "This," she said, her voice low but sharp as a pin, "is the final supervisory clearance document for the $4.1 billion merger between Genesis Holdings and Havenport Airlines." Turner froze for several seconds, then swallowed hard. You're the final signatory?" "Not just the signatory. I'm the only one authorized to cancel the process if any operational breaches violate the principles outlined in our funding terms." The room grew colder, not because of the air conditioning, but because power had just been placed on the table, in the most literal sense. "You're not a VIP," Turner stammered. Adelaise tilted her head, her voice lower now, but with a metallic stillness. "No, I'm not a VIP. I don't need to be pampered. I was sent here to see what people like you would do when you thought I was no one. And by now, they had done enough. Inside operations. Holding 3B, after placing the high-level access card and the red envelope on the icy surface of the table, Adelaise did not stand up. Instead, she pulled from her tote a device as slim as a tablet, matte black, unbranded, with only a blue indicator light blinking every 2 seconds. This was not an iPad. This was an FIDSEC device, an internal security tool from Genesis Holdings, issued exclusively to fiduciary agents, authorized to access the technical layers of partner operation systems. Each device was triple encrypted with biometrics, a daily rotating password, and a randomly generated confirmation code verified through the financial center in Zurich. She placed her thumb on the screen, then entered the iris scan code. Within 1.7 seconds, the dashboard interface appeared. Live audit mode, Havenport Airlines, Flight HX 791, Gate C12, first class. Adelaise did not press any buttons, because the system had already begun logging events the moment her boarding pass was denied at the gate. The screen displayed each incident. 0602 a.m. Carolyn at gate. C12 skips boarding pass scan, says only, step aside. 0603 a.m. The male passenger behind is let through without scanning. 6:11 a.m. Sloan whispers to the assistant attendant. She doesn't fit first class. 06:27 a.m. No water service for the first 38 minutes. 06:35 a.m. Meal served at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, when required minimum is 130 degrees Fahrenheit. 06:49 a.m. Passenger 5. Questions. She's first class? Not addressed. 0703 a.m. Cabin manager. Bryce verifies ticket info without a valid system reason. Facial recognition from the jet bridge entry camera, cabin interior surveillance, and the full transcript of internal radio communications had all been integrated and recorded with near 100% accuracy. While Turner remained frozen in place, eyes still fixed on the Genesis Level 4 badge, Adelaise lightly tapped the dashboard's upper left icon. Submit Initial Ethics Alert. 3 seconds later, the Genesis Ethics Compliance symbol appeared on screen, accompanied by a warning. Warning. Ethics violation detected. Investment suspension initiated. All partner-level engagements are on temporary hold, pending internal review. Financial coverage of $4.1 billion is suspended under Clause 17.3. Turner stammered. We didn't know who you were. Adelaise required no justification. She unlocked her phone, the screen lit up, dozens of missed calls. One name stood out in bold. E. Moreland, Havenport CEO. She declined the call. Edward Moreland, CEO of Havenport Airlines, once dubbed the strategist redefining executive aviation by Business Air magazine, was no longer worth answering. Because the matter had transcended management, It had entered the Global Financial Strategy Command Center of Genesis. On the 28th floor of Genesis Holdings headquarters in Chicago, the ethics room team had already received a red-level alert, a severity tier that only 3 individuals in the corporation were authorized to trigger. All Genesis-linked systems connected to Havnport Airlines were instantly placed into freeze status. No new capital disbursements, temporary suspension of credit insurance approvals, revocation of API access from affiliate banks. Havnport was officially flagged as an entity under ethical review. Simultaneously, the name Adelaise Baker was removed from the internal list, Passengers of Concern, a classification tag mistakenly assigned to just 0.01% of business class travelers due to AI misidentification based on appearance inconsistent with premium consumer behavior. But by now, that no longer mattered. The system was merely scrambling to correct itself. Unfortunately, everything had already been recorded, and real power doesn't lie in being apologized to. It lies in forcing the structure to change. And that, Adelaise had accomplished without ever raising her voice. The next morning, in a closed-door meeting room on the 14th floor of Havnport Airlines' headquarters in Denver, 3 empty chairs awaited their occupants. Sloan, the lead flight attendant on flight HX791, Carolyn, the gate control agent at boarding gate C12, and Trent, the international first-class route supervisor for the Western Operations Division. They had not been informed of the meeting's purpose. Only a brief email from internal HR titled, "Compliance Debrief. Urgent attendance required." Below it, bold letters read, "Estimated duration, indefinite." Inside the room, on a 65-inch LCD screen, was the interface of the Genesis HVN Integrated Ethics Protocols Passenger Behavior Monitoring System. Next to it were excerpts from internal cameras, cabin crew radio audio, and a detailed timeline tagging each incident labeled discriminatory behavior / customer mistreatment. In total, 17 violations were listed in the report. Each act was time-stamped down to the exact second. But what cast a heavy silence over the room wasn't the video clips. It was a red notification line running across the bottom of the report slide. Decision Authority. Ms. Adelaise Baker, Senior Fiduciary Agent, Equity Partner of Genesis Holdings. The internal officer, a middle-aged woman in a deep navy suit who did not introduce herself, looked directly at them. This was not a technical error. This was a pattern of selectively repeated behavior. She emphasized the final phrase, selectively repeated. Trent tried to raise his hand. "We didn't know who she was. There was no specific directive." "That's exactly the problem," the officer replied curtly. "You didn't need a directive, because your system has been conditioned to believe that doesn't look like first class means doesn't deserve first-class service." Sloan pressed her lips together, while Carolyn stared at the floor. The decisions were delivered on the spot. No arguments, no appeals process. Sloan, removed from international routes, temporarily reassigned to the low-tier San Bernardino, El Paso domestic line, 18-month promotion freeze. Carolyn, transferred to baggage support in the regional warehouse, no further direct passenger contact. Trent, stripped of supervisory duties, reassigned to administrative work at the Flight Crew Training Center. In the internal documentation, these actions were labeled retraining, but everyone understood. It was a polite term for demotion. There was no outrage from Adelaise. She didn't demand anyone be fired. No formal complaint. No social media post. She wasn't even present at the hearing. But the weight of the title, Senior Equity Partner, the final sign-off authority in billion-dollar strategic financial transactions, was enough to make the entire system recalibrate itself. And notably, Genesis did not manually intervene. Their behavior analysis algorithms had independently escalated the case to red-level status once the dashboard detected bias deviations based on visual appearance. An email from Genesis Holdings was sent to the entire executive board of Havenport Airlines. The woman who was disregarded in seat 2A was not a dissatisfied customer. She is the holder of a 22% controlling stake in Genesis Trust Fund Tier 4, the entity backing the deal with your company. And we do not offer second chances to operational systems that fail ethical standards. In that moment, first class ceased to be about a plane ticket. It became a moral exam, and Havenport had just failed it before anyone could revise their answers. 7:12 a.m., 3 days after the incident on flight HX. 791, the boarding gate area B8, domestic terminal of Chancellor Airport, was bustling as usual. Flights to Cleveland, Kansas City, and Milwaukee scrolled across the LED screen. Ground staff smiled at passengers, and luggage lined neatly along divider ropes. Among them stood a woman in a Navy flight attendant uniform, next to the boarding lane for a domestic flight to Milwaukee, a route less than 2 hours long in economy class. That woman was Sloan. No more red silk scarf symbolizing the first-class lead crew. No more indifferent eyes, mechanical smiles. Instead, her face was hollow with fatigue. Her gaze avoided all contact. 3 days ago, she was a chief attendant on an international business route. Now, she was coordinating water bottles for seat 28D. A female voice rose behind her, making Sloan flinch. "Good morning." She turned, then froze. Adelaise Baker, dressed in a long black trench coat, pointed high heels, and a dark brown leather suitcase in hand. No more tote bag. No more hoodie. Sloan couldn't say a word. She simply looked down. Lips tightened, shoulders trembled, not from the cold. Adelaise looked at her for a moment, voice steady like a December lake. "You once said I didn't belong in first class." Silence. Sloan nodded faintly, as if every muscle in her face had to resist the gravity of shame. Adelaise didn't scold. She didn't raise her voice, didn't mock. She only tilted her head and gave the slightest smile. "You were right." Sloan looked up, eyes dimly searching for a chance, for a pardon. But Adelaise continued, each word echoing through the small gate area like frost-laced bells. "I don't belong. I came to buy it." 4 seconds of silence passed, stretching like a lifetime as the truth struck dead center. Sloan didn't breathe, didn't react. She stood frozen, hands clenched so tight the knuckles went pale. She understood. Understood that the woman she once dismissed and belittled was now the owner of 22% equity in Genesis Holdings, the firm holding supreme financial power to either save or sink any undercapitalized airline in the post-COVID world. Understood that Adelaise didn't need to demand anything, didn't need to demote anyone, didn't need to lift a finger. The operational system had cleared the path for her on its own, and now she was simply present, as a living reminder that you never know who's listening. A passing technician smiled at Sloan, then glanced at Adelaise, unaware why the air pressure in the room felt so suddenly suffocating. The boarding coordinator called Group 2. A young mother pulled her son forward. A businessman typed briskly on his phone. Everything around them continued as normal, except Sloa, who felt as though the world had tilted off its axis. Adelaise turned. The click of her heels struck in rhythm, beat by beat, like the final count for a career chapter now closed. She needed no more words, because those who needed to understand already did. And those who had once failed now knew never to repeat it. And in a world where every apology is hollow without consequence, a single line from Adelaise, "I came to buy it," was the highest form of warning. No spectacle, no posturing, but a definitive end to the kind of unspoken arrogance that once believed someone like her didn't belong here. Inside the 36-story glass tower located in the financial district of downtown Dallas, the executive boardroom of Havenport Airlines no longer felt spacious enough to contain the weight of just 2 words: delay. 9:02 a.m. While other airlines were announcing their Q2 earnings on the NASDAQ, Havenport CEO Edward Moreland opened an email titled Genesis Holdings Investment Protocol. Update. Flagged. The content was only 3 lines long, but each word cut like a thin, cold, precise blade. Stakeholder Adelaise Baker has initiated a hold under Clause 17.3. Final tranche approval for $410 million deferred. Next scheduled review. Q4 pending ethical audit results. CFO. Darren Liu dropped his pen onto the table, not out of anger, but because his hand could no longer hold on to anything. Chief Legal Officer Marla Finley furrowed her brows. We thought that the equity stake belonged to an anonymous trust? There was no need to answer anymore. The truth was, the woman their employees had treated like an outsider, like someone who'd wandered mistakenly into first class, was the only person with the authority to decide the fate of the $410 million investment deal. The missing piece. Havenport needed to survive short-term debt that was 1 step away from triggering asset seizure by the bank. On the 5th floor of Chancellor Airport, in the premium lounge reserved for shareholders and strategic investors, Adelaise sat alone. She wore a dark brown suit, and the black coffee in her hand hadn't been touched. On the table was the familiar FIDSEC device, this time showing a screen titled Approve Investment Completion, Final Round. Response deadline, 71 hours, 58 minutes, 14 seconds. Beneath were 2 clear buttons. Approve. Defernaisar. She didn't deliberate long. No need for anger, no need for explanation. She simply pressed defer. Delay. Instantly, a series of internal emails were automatically dispatched to various departments. Disbursement of the Fleet Modernization Fund suspended. Approval for Asia-Pacific route restructuring canceled. Draft integration of the Customer Ecosystem API partnership frozen. Guarantee access portal with CreditEase Bank locked. And most importantly, all financial partners in Genesis's network would receive an alert downgrading Havenport's ethical compliance rating to C. This alone could trigger at least 8 commercial contracts worth over $720 million to be pulled back for further review. She didn't need them to kneel, didn't need a letter of apology, didn't need a meeting invite. Because in the world of finance, an apology holds no weight compared to a single signature line. She was simply doing one very straightforward thing, letting them taste the flavor of their policy, dismissive, cold, and indifferent when assuming the other person has no power. They called. They emailed. They marked everything urgent. But her screen displayed only one quiet line. Pending final signature. Awaiting stakeholder discretion. For nearly 3 days to come, Havenport's entire financial strategy would stall. Shareholders would grow uneasy, and market analysts would fan rumors that Genesis might pull out. The stock price had already dropped 3.1% in the first 48 hours after the deferral. In an internal meeting, Havenport's COO asked bluntly, "How do we reach her again?" "To calm things down?" The PR director replied quietly. "We had that chance." But she walked out the door with dignity, and we're now searching for keys in a room with no door. Inside the lounge, Adelaise looked out through the tall glass window, where the morning light shimmered across the marble floor. No one knew what she was thinking. But one thing was certain. Kindness, when tested too much, does not return just because someone fumbled and lost it. Adelaise Baker's story is not just a lesson in silent power, but a profound reminder that discrimination doesn't have to shout to exist. It seeps through every glance, every small decision. And systems only change when someone dares to test their decency. A first-class seat does not prove one's worth, but how people react to someone who doesn't look the part says everything. Adelaise didn't seek revenge. She simply returned the system to the mirror and made those who once looked down on her live with the consequences they authored. What do you think? Is silence the strongest form of resistance in an era filled with noise and spectacle? Leave your thoughts below. And if you believe this story is worth sharing, don't forget to like and subscribe to Black Strength Stories, a channel that honors courageous, intelligent Black individuals who refuse to be defined by narrow-minded expectations. We have many more inspiring stories waiting for you.